everybody. Hi. So, yeah, my name's Mikaela, and I work here in the planning department. And I apologize that it is 5:30 on a Wednesday, and we are about to talk about zoning. But you signed up for it, so just remember that. I will do my best to keep it lively, but I make no guarantees. We're here tonight to talk about the last part of the Integrated Development Ordinance, administration and enforcement, how we administer the code and how we enforce the code. And many of you have joined us for the trainings that we've done on other parts of the Integrated Development Ordinance that I will probably immediately start calling the IDO, Integrated Development Ordinance, to save myself a few syllables. Hope everybody's comfortable with that. All of the presentations that we've done are online as PDFs that are downloadable, as well as the handouts. So if you wanted to take it to one of your meetings and give them the same presentation, you can download the full slides as well as the handouts to that. You can see kind of the training schedule that we've done here. And if you go to the project website, abc-zone.com, and pull up this PDF, all of these blue underlined boxes that you'll see throughout the presentation are actually hyperlinks. So when you download that PDF and click, it'll take you to the actual document online. Otherwise, you can just search around the project website and find it as well. So, as we've discussed many times, and many of you are starting to get comfortable, the idea behind the Integrated Development Ordinance is that it's not a narrative. It's not a book that you read. It's not a plan that has a vision. It's a resource book with rules in it. And you're only going to use it to answer the questions that you've got, and you're only going to read the parts that are going to help answer those questions. And so if I've got a question, for example, about a zone district, I'm going to jump right into part 2, which talks about the zone districts. If I've got a question about use, how can I use my property, or how can my neighbor use their property, I'm going to go straight to part 4. And in part 4, I'm going to need to look at 2 different things. We'll take a closer look at them in a second. I need to look at both the use table and the use-specific standards. And I just made this mistake today. Someone called me on the phone, asked me, what can I do? I only looked at the use table, and I gave him an answer. And then he hung up, looked at the use-specific standards, and called me back and said, but I think it says in the use-specific standards that I can't actually do what I want. So don't make the mistake that I just made today. You have to look at both things to get the full answer to the question, can I do a particular thing on a property? If I've got a question about any other development standard, whether it's parking or landscaping or how high my building can be, what my setbacks are, how far my building needs to be set back from my property line, all of that is going to be in part 4, where if you're familiar with today's zoning code, we today call these the general regulations, so it's very similar. And tonight, as you know, we're taking a closer look at the part 6, administration and enforcement. So just taking a step backward, just to kind of remind ourselves where we've been. When I need to answer the question, what can happen on a property, I've already said that you need to come to the use table, which is table 421 in the document. And before I do that, I need to know what is the zoning on the property in question. Is it one of the residential zones, of which there are several? Is it a mixed use zone, of which there are several, or is it a non-residential zone, meaning residential is not allowed in that zone, and there are one of several? Once I have the information about the zoning of the property, I can come to the use table and follow down the columns in terms of zones, or follow across in terms of uses to discover whether that use is allowed in a particular zone. The next piece of information that I need is what is next to the property that I'm asking the question about. Because if the property is next to low-density residential, for example, a single-family home or a duplex or a townhouse, then certain uses become either more restricted, made conditional, meaning there's an extra process that that property owner has to go through to get permission to use that use, or they're outright prohibited in order to make sure that the development that happens next to that single family or duplex or townhouse use, those low density residential uses, are compatible. The other piece of information I need before I can dive into the document is whether the property in question is next to major public open space, by which I mean city-owned or city-managed open space. So can anyone give me an example of major public open space? Kathy can.
You mean like Elena Gallegos?
Elena Gallegos Foothills would be major public open space. Another example?
Is the land, is that privately held? Is that non-residential?
Which land, Kathy?
Okay.
For what?
I'm thinking about the land that my neighborhood association owns, which
You're-
is non-residential.
That's private.
Non-city.
It's non-city, privately held open space. So that would not be major public open space. But the Petroglyph National Monument, that is major public open space. Major arroyos, many of them are major public open space. The Bosque, major public open space. Okay, so city-owned or managed open spaces. So once I know what's next to the property that I'm asking the question about, low-density residential or major public open space, then the second thing I dive into in the document are the use-specific standards. I find them in section 1416.4. Part 4 in the IDO is generally about uses. We're right behind the use table are all the use-specific standards. And there you'll find many of the powerful protections to make sure that those uses are compatible with their context. So uses will become more restricted next to major public open space, whether they become conditional, prohibited outright, or just have extra standards that you have to meet in order to have that use next to major public open space. And again, a lot more detail online as part of the zones and uses training. The second question that many people have when they dive into this document is, what are my development standards? What standards do I have to meet, or what standards does my neighbor have to meet in order to develop that property? And the answer to that question depends on several factors. And again, these factors are ways that the Integrated Development Ordinance provides both protections for things that we care about, like single-family neighborhoods or major public open space, but also incentives, ways that we encourage the kind of development where it's appropriate. And so the first factor that we're going to look at that changes your development standards is whether that property is in an overlay zone. And an overlay zone, just like it sounds, you've got standards associated with that zone district that we talked about, and over those standards are these other provisions for a geographic area that say, these are the special rules for fill in the blank for insert special place here. So those overlay standards prevail over the base zone standards. So your development standards are by definition different in overlays. Another factor that changes your development standards is whether that property is in a center or corridor. These are places in the comprehensive plan, places mapped in the comprehensive plan, which is the policy document that the city has, that says here are the places where growth and development is most appropriate. And the most appropriate form for that development to take is something a little bit more urban than the rest of Albuquerque, which is still going to be fairly suburban in its pattern. So the Integrated Development Ordinance helps to implement that centers and corridors vision from the comprehensive plan by providing both incentives and development standards that incentivize that slightly more urban development than the rest of Albuquerque. Another factor is still going to be your context. So if you're next to single-family development, certain development standards change. If you're next to major public open space, you've got a whole different set of design standards that you have to meet, such as view fencing, to make sure that we can still see into the Bosque, for example, next to your development. And lastly, your zone category is absolutely going to change your development standards as well. The standards associated with residential development, for example, are very different from the standards that we might want for non-residential development. So you can look up each of these factors in a map. Right now, it's online as an interactive map on the project webpage. And then once you figure out, am I in or out of a center, notice these are color-coded, and there are buttons at the bottom of the interactive map that track with the numbers of the parts of the Integrated Development Ordinance. So button 2 shows you the maps of the centers and corridors, because those are all maps out of the comprehensive plan. Part 3 is your overlay zones. So you can go to button 3 to understand which overlays your property might be in. Part 4 we just talked about were uses. And part 5 are going to be the development standards that might vary in terms of context. And lastly, you can always look up your zoning on pretty much any of these buttons. There will be a way to look up your zoning, but it also is kind of under that base zone information under button 1. Once you do dive into the document, it's online now and downloadable as a PDF. On May 17th, when it goes into effect, it will move onto the publications page for the Planning Department, where you go now for many of our published and adopted documents. That document right now is fully searchable, so you can do a Control F to search. It's hyperlinked, it's got bookmarks. We've tried really hard to make it as user-friendly as possible as a download, or you can open it from your browser as well. More information about the development standards training is online, as the presentation from a few weeks ago. In terms of the kinds of things in those development standards, here's a quick snapshot, a quick list of the kinds of things that we regulate here in the city of Albuquerque in terms of development. And they're all things that help to raise and ensure the quality of design and development here in the city. Within each of these sections, the organization is the same. So each of these sections, whether it's about walls or building design or signs, each of those sections starts with a purpose statement. Why does the city have rules about landscaping? Then you've got the applicability and exemption section. Who do these rules apply to and who is exempt? Which properties are exempt? Which areas might be exempt? And next, we tried to put as much information as possible in tables. What do you think works better, zoning in language or zoning in tables? Zoning's hard in either way, but which do you think is going to be a little bit more clear?
I'm a language person.
You love the language. Yeah. That's not the answer I wanted, Kathy. The rest of you?
Tables.
Tables. So zoning in language tends to be problematic. And we tried as much as possible to keep things clear and concise and organized by zone. And we use tables for that.
But can't that also lead to some mistakes, because a table misses the nuances that language might supply?
Sometimes. If it was something that we needed nuance about, we left it as text.
Okay.
And if it is in text, we went in this general order. We first described things that are citywide, so rules that apply to most people. Then we described anything that was a center or corridor provision, so provisions that were specific to a center or corridor. And lastly, we described anything that had to do with a small geographic area, whether it was an overlay or a one-off rule that's mapped as a small area in the Integrated Development Ordinance. Okay, so the question of the night, what about review and approval process? How do I know how that property over there, whether they need to give me notice or not as a neighbor when they go to develop? Or who do I need to ask and get an approval from to do different kinds of development? Question?
When you said it was an overlay or a one-off rule, what part or section are those listed under?
So if it's a one-off rule about walls and fences in a particular neighborhood, it would go, the walls and fences are going to go in this order, and this little section all the way at the...
That's what I'm talking about.
Right, so it's going to be within each of these at the bottom. Okay, so it depends on what the topic is first. So go to the topic first, and then look all the way to the back of that section to find those small areas. There's also an index at the front of the document, right after the table of contents, that indexes all of the small area provisions. So if you know an area that you're interested in, for example, you can go to Table 2, right after the table of contents, and look up that area alphabetically and see all the rules that are specific to that area indexed for you. All right, so when I've got a question about who needs to approve my development or what kind of notice do I need to provide if I'm going to develop my parcel, I'm going to go to Table 611. in Part 6, the Administration and Enforcement section of the Integrated Development Ordinance. And again, I need to know several pieces of information before I can even dive into the document. The first thing I need to know is, does that development have a residential component or not? If it does, are they doing single family or duplexes or some other low density residential development, in which case I want to know, are the lots already platted? If they have already been platted, that's going to send you down one path toward development. If they still need to be platted, it's just one big chunk of land and I need to carve it up or subdivide it into multiple lots that then get developed as single family, then that's kind of a different development path. So if I'm a neighbor and I have a big vacant parcel next to me and I get a notice in my email, one of the questions I'm going to ask them is, okay, are you developing something with a residential component? Have you already platted or not? And if you're doing a multifamily development, many people call those apartments. If I'm going to do apartments, how many dwelling units are you doing? If they're doing under a certain number of units, then it'll be reviewed administratively by staff. If they're over that threshold, then it's going to be reviewed at a public meeting or hearing. Second question, are you doing a non-residential component? And if so, how many gross square feet? What's the gross floor area of your development? Again, over a certain threshold, it's going to be decided at a public meeting or hearing. Under that threshold, it'll be decided administratively by staff. And lastly, I still need to know the context. If the property in question is 5 acres or greater next to major public open space, then that development has to go to the Planning Commission, the Environmental Planning Commission, before anything else happens. And the Environmental Planning Commission need to give an approval for a site plan even before they subdivide. So context also matters in terms of development process. Similarly, if that property is in a historic protection overlay zone, so a historic district, then the Landmarks Commission, which has commissioners that are well-versed in historic preservation, they are going to be involved in that review and decision process. So let's take a closer look at what these thresholds are. So administrative decisions are for developments with residential components where the lots are already platted, if they're doing low-density residential. If they're doing multifamily, then they need to be doing 50 or fewer dwelling units. Over that threshold, it becomes that decision requiring a public meeting or hearing. In terms of the non-residential component, the threshold is set at 50,000 square feet. So at 50,000 or below, it can be decided administratively by staff. And they come in requesting a site plan administrative. In terms of the Development Review Board, they're going to see site plans that are over those administrative thresholds, and we just talked about those. So over 50 dwelling units, over 50,000 square feet of gross floor area for non-residential development. They also see all the platting actions. So if those lots haven't been platted yet and they need new roads or they need major infrastructure, then the person coming in is going to request a subdivision, either minor or major, based on how much infrastructure they need and how many units they're doing. And they'll be asking for that from the Development Review Board. Lastly, there's kind of a new role or a slightly expanded role for the Development Review Board in terms of variances. So a variance is a request for an exception to some standard in the Integrated Development Ordinance. So the Development Review Board, and only the Development Review Board, has purview over variance requests associated with access and connectivity, so the street grid, right? Access and connectivity, subdivision of land, so all of those platting actions, and parking and loading. So how you lay out your parking, how you take access from the street. And I hope you can see that all of these have to do with how the public and the private realms kind of come together. And that's really what Development Review Board's strength is looking at that interface between the public and the private realms. In terms of the Environmental Planning Commission, or EPC, the EPC looks at site plans for zones that are kind of considered one-off kinds of zones. So the first is a mixed-use, form-based zone. So these are a category of zones that we have in the zoning code today as optional. And they remain an optional zone in the Integrated Development Ordinance that you can ask for a zone change to that MXFB, and it requires that the Planning Commission also look at and approve a site plan for that site. Form-based just means that we care more about how your building looks and how it operates on the site and less about what's in it. So instead of having a use table for the form-based zone, for example, there's a very short list of things that you can't do, and otherwise you're encouraged to mix uses. And what we really care about is the form that your building takes. NRPO stands for non-residential parks and open space. So if you're going to get a zone change to NRPOC, for example, Kathy, if your homeowners association wanted to designate more of your site as an open space, you could get you could request a zone change to NRPOC, signaling that it's a private open space. And if you were ever to do anything, put a trail in or anything else on that open space, you would need to get a site plan approved from the Environmental Planning Commission. PC stands for planned community. These are very large, more than 100-acre sites where you're really trying to create a new self-sufficient community. Mesa del Sol is an example, Westland is another example, the two examples that we've got within the city limits. Planned development is a smaller site, so it has to be between 2 acres and 20 acres. And you're doing something that you can't do in any of the other base zones. You've got some innovative project, you're going to break some rules, but it's for a really good reason. You can go to the Planning Commission and ask for that planned development, negotiate what your standards are, and get a site plan approved from the Planning Commission. Anytime you want to change anything, you go back to the Planning Commission to have that site plan amended. Last is NRSU, non-residential sensitive use. This is a small list of 11 items, 11 uses that are one-off. They're strange, we can't write zoning rules for them, we just need to think about them on a case-by-case basis. These are things like cemeteries, fire stations, police stations. They need heightened scrutiny, what's going to happen on that site because of that weird one-off use. So anytime that NRSU site wants to change, they've got to come back to the Planning Commission for an amendment to their site plan. I already mentioned that any property next to major public open space that's 5 acres or greater has to go to the Planning Commission for a site plan before anything else happens on that site, to make sure that you're maximizing your opportunities to be a good, compatible neighbor to that major public open space, and that you're doing everything you can to minimize the impact of your development on that public resource that we need to keep pristine in perpetuity. There's a couple other kind of categories. People can choose kind of to go to the Planning Commission if they'd like extra review or an extra public process. There are some other facility plans in the city that require the Planning Commission review, and those are carried over into the Integrated Development Ordinance. The next thing that the Planning Commission does in terms of this IDO admin and enforcement section is they look at zone changes to the NRBP, non-residential business park, NRBP. So that also involves the zone change request and a master development plan. So to do development on a site, to do a business park, you need to get the zone change to NRBP and get an approved master development plan. It's very similar to today's process for industrial park. There are other things that the Planning Commission does that are kind of captured on Table 611. They hear appeals of the impact fee assessment, which is an administrative decision. They also hear waivers to the WTF, or wireless telecommunication facilities. And most importantly, the Planning Commission is either a recommending body or a decision-making body for policy decisions. This last category of decisions are those that the decision maker is not only looking at the regulations in the Integrated Development Ordinance, but even more importantly, looking at the policies from the comprehensive plan and any other city policy document that's relevant. So it could be a facility plan, could be a natural resource plan. Those policies come into play when people are asking, for example, to make a change of zoning, or to change the text of the Integrated Development Ordinance, or to annex land, all those kinds of things. I've lost my clicker. It's behind me. Yes. So in terms of those thresholds of development, the Integrated Development Ordinance makes several improvements over today's system in terms of notice. So today, if I've got a straight zone, for example, C1 or M1, there's no notice required in terms of me developing my site. I come in straight to building permit, no notice required. As long as I follow all the rules, I get my building permit, I can start constructing. Under the Integrated Development Ordinance, even if I've got a straight zone, I don't have to go to the Planning Commission for a site plan, I still have to post a sign on my property saying I am submitting for building permit, and I have to send an email to the neighborhood association. I have submitted for building permit. And that's the heads up to the property owners surrounding and the neighborhood association to go look at the city website for that building permit information and send in comments if you'd like. But there's really no staff discretion in terms of that approval. All we're doing is looking at the Integrated Development Ordinance to see have they met the standards or not, because their use is already permissive. They're already allowed to do what they need to do. All we need to do is check, do they meet all the standards that's required. In terms of the site plan DRB or site plan EPC, more notice is required. So you also have, the city is also going to publish a notice in the, a legal ad in the newspaper. We'll also do a web posting of the agenda for that public meeting or hearing, for example. There's mailed notice required to the property owners surrounding that proposed development. And there's also this nice little category of meetings. So this is really a close-up of Table 611 that's just looking at these public notice and meetings. The meetings is a brand new requirement. So for the site plan DRB and site plan EPC, before that applicant can actually apply, they've got to meet with staff. That's the pre-application meeting. You've got to meet with staff, say, here's what I'm doing. We make sure that you've got everything, all your ducks in a row, so that you can then go submit. You also have to meet with the neighborhood association. So today, we have something called the facilitated meeting, which happens later in the process, usually after a public hearing when things have gotten hot and heavy, blown up, and we decide, ooh, maybe they need a facilitated meeting, see what they can work out on the side. This is a requirement to meet with the neighborhood association before that application comes into the city, so that if the neighborhood has concerns, they can be discussed and hopefully remedied even before that applicant comes in to the city.
But no notes are required from those meetings, so we don't have any documentation of what was discussed.
So in the Integrated Development Ordinance, there's certain requirements that the applicant needs to show. If the meeting happens, they've got to show where it happened, a sign-in sheet, a discussion of the conversation, what concerns were raised, what they were able to meet, what they weren't able to meet, and why not. We may, as things go on administratively, require that minutes get taken or minutes get shared with the neighborhood association, but for now, that's not a requirement in the IDO. We can require it later if things are not going well as part of just the administration of the code. Question?
So it seems like on the administrative approval that there's no pre-application meeting
Correct.
required.
Correct.
So anything that would go through administrative approval, then how do neighborhoods have any kind of, what if they have concerns about something that's going in?
So again, let me just point out that If they're coming in for a site plan administrative, there's no discretion. The city can't ask for more than is in the Integrated Development Ordinance.
But that's where we get back to where the table may have missed some nuanced issues.
So for sites that have a site plan EPC, these are the things that really get negotiated in front of the Planning Commission. And for those, there's absolutely the public meeting required, or the neighborhood meeting required, and there's absolutely the pre-application meeting required.
What about shopping centers? Those are done with EPC.
Under today's system, that's true. Under this new system, the threshold is 50,000 square feet. So let me just point out one more time that under today's system, if I've got C1, for example, there's no size limit. I can be as big as I want. I go straight to building permit. I have no notice that I'm required to give. Under the new system, I've got to post my sign, and I have to give that letter to the neighborhood association.
But it doesn't matter because it's all going to be approved anyways.
If they meet all the standards, it'll be approved. If they don't, they won't be. We have no discretion over extra things to ask for. We just use the Integrated Development Ordinance to say, have they met it or not?
So what if there's a nuanced issue that comes up? Is there an appeal process for an administrator?
Absolutely. Any decision can be appealed. That's true today. It's true under the Integrated Development Ordinance. If it's an administrative decision, it's going to be a very technical appeal. It's not going to be about process. It's going to be about they didn't meet a standard.
Mikaela, I'm sorry, I need a little education on
Please.
terms.
Yeah.
Can you back up and break down for me the terms administrative and enforcement? I've heard you use enforcement once, and I wish I had like an org chart in my head
Yeah.
of how EPC figures in. So I'm still coming up to terms on this stuff.
No
Can you
worries.
help me?
Sure. So when I say administrative decision, for example, I'm talking about some staff in the planning department. So that could be someone from a delegee, it could be the zoning enforcement officer who is in charge of our code enforcement division. They're involved today in all of those zoning checks that happen as you go to building permit, and they will continue to be doing the site plan administrative reviews.
Over permitting
Yes.
or prior to permitting.
It's simultaneous, but yes. Yeah, you can't get your permit if you haven't met your zone
Okay.
requirements.
Okay.
That's for site plan administrative. There are other decisions in this table that are decided by different members of staff. So the archaeological certificate, for example, we don't review that because we're not archaeologists. We send that to someone with that expertise. So it's a broad category of staff gets to make the decision. It's not a board or commission. Does that make sense? So we've got a historic preservation planner, for example, who does, who reviews certificates of appropriateness in historic areas that are minor. Mostly what we mean by administrative is it's not a board or commission that requires a public meeting or hearing. In terms of enforcement, that's usually what happens after someone has developed. So we've done the zone check in order to get them their building permit or get them their approval. After they've developed, code enforcement are the ones who actually, if someone flags a problem, I think someone's parking on more than they're supposed to park in their front yard, or they've let their weeds grow too long. Code enforcement is a division within the planning department that does that. Does that answer your two questions?
Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for asking. All right. I think I've talked a little bit already about each of these kinds of notice that might be required, and again, specified for each of those decisions in Table 611. In terms of the responsibilities, it's all spelled out in Section 64K of the Integrated Development Ordinance, so it specifies what's the type of notice, who's actually doing it, how do they do it. So for example, if you know the Office of Neighborhood Coordination, they're the ones who keep the list of neighborhood associations and recognized, unrecognized, homeowners associations, all those folks. They will continue to be the ones who keep that list. And so an applicant needs to go to the Office of Neighborhood Coordination to get the relevant list to send emails to, for example, when that's required, or mailing addresses. Okay, in terms of the neighborhood meeting, just to kind of outline how that's going to happen, the Integrated Development Ordinance does specify a timeline for all of these things. So first thing that happens is the applicant goes to the Office of Neighborhood Coordination and gets the list of neighborhood associations that either include the project site or are adjacent to it, meaning across the street. And they get those email addresses and they offer a meeting to those email addresses on file. The neighborhood association has 15 days to respond yes or no. If you don't respond after 15 days, the applicant can move forward into the application process. If you say yes, if the neighborhood association says yes, they'd like a meeting, then that meeting needs to get scheduled within 30 days of that saying yes. So there's kind of a timeline to make sure that we're keeping things moving. If the neighborhood association declines on day one, then that application can go ahead and that applicant can come in and submit. In terms of the actual requirements, I already mentioned that the Integrated Development Ordinance specifies here are the things that the applicant actually needs to have prepared to show the neighborhood association. And once they apply, here are the things that they need to show if that meeting happened in terms of the sign-in, the summary of discussion, concerns, all of those things, so that that is part of their application materials.
So they file go back. So we have that little neighborhood meeting, and they submit proof of meeting.
Mm-hmm.
If at that point in time, let's say the neighborhood said, yeah, right, this wasn't enough. We've not reached common agreements here.
Mm-hmm.
We would like another meeting or whatever. Do we have any recourse at that point in
Mm-hmm.
time? Because the minutes, I mean, they're showing you that they had the meeting.
Right.
They're not showing you a lot of the details of the discussion or the areas of non-agreement.
No, but they are supposed to say what they were able to accommodate and what they weren't, and if they weren't, why they couldn't.
Okay,
So they do have to say, here's all the things we heard. Some of them were,
but we don't get to, neighborhoods
It's
don't
almost
see
on the
that.
onus of the neighborhood association.
You need to follow up.
Median, please send me a copy of what you're providing to the planning department.
yes, and you all, I mean, all of our records are public. And so if you're going to follow that development through the process, you're going to want to look at what they've submitted.
And then what's the recourse if things have been misrepresented?
So there's two things, that all of those neighborhood meetings are part of decisions that require a public meeting or hearing. So you can go to the public meeting or hearing and say, they haven't represented what happened well, or they didn't meet these things, I still think we can get this, that, or the other. The other recourse you've got is you can always request a facilitated meeting at that point. And the facilitated meeting happens through our land use mediation service. The planning director just says, yes, that's appropriate, go have a facilitated meeting, or no, that's not appropriate, keep going through the meeting or hearing schedule, okay? All right, the Integrated Development Ordinance has two different ways that provide a little bit of flexibility for folks who discover new circumstances as they're going through either their approval process or even after they've gotten an approval. If it's before they've gotten their approval, that applicant can ask for a deviation. These are small little wiggle room specified in Table 641. It's 10% here, 15% there for different line items. If they're asking for a deviation above what's specified in that table, it's really a variance, and they need to go through the variance process. The deviation is an administrative process that they can keep going through as they're in front of the Planning Commission, for example, or as they're in front of the Development Review Board, or as part of their site plan administrative review. There is decision criteria associated with any deviation, so it has to be documented that here is why they met the criteria for that deviation, and it gets documented in that approval. After that approval is given, there's also a similar amount of wiggle room, 10% here, 15% there, for different line items in Table 644. Again, there's criteria associated with giving those administrative amendments after that approval was given. And if they're asking for more than that, then it really becomes an amendment to their approval, and they've got to go back to the original decision-making body to get it. So we are, as administratively as staff, we have a little bit of wiggle room that we can provide, again, for circumstances that they couldn't foresee when they were originally going through the process. If they're asking for more than what's allowed in Table 644, then they've got to go back to that original decision-making body to get a major amendment. Overlay zones, by the way, automatically go back to the decision-making body. So if that property is within a character protection overlay, a historic protection overlay, any of those overlays, administratively, staff does not have discretion, and it has to go back to that decision-making body for that amendment. Okay? Okay, variances. Let's talk about it. So we have the wiggle room of deviation or administrative amendment after that approval. If it's above those thresholds, then what they're really asking for is a variance. A variance is an exception to the standard in the Integrated Development Ordinance. So I already mentioned that the Development Review Board sees variances for things related to the street grid, so access and connectivity, subdivision of land, and parking and loading. The Environmental Planning Commission can now give variances for anything that aren't those 3 sections that are under the purview of the Development Review Board. So if I'm in front of the Planning Commission because, let's say, I have a planned development zone, a PD zone, the Planning Commission is the one looking at my site plan, I can ask the Planning Commission for a variance to anything that's not 5.3, 5.4, or 5.5. And the Planning Commission can weigh that and decide yes or no, that's an appropriate variance. If I'm not in front of the Planning Commission, then it's still the zoning hearing examiner as it is today. This is a lawyer at a public hearing where you go and you say, I need relief or an exception from this particular standard, and there's the criteria, whether that's a good exception to grant or not. In each of these cases, there's language under that decision criteria that says they need to be asking for the smallest amount possible to be able to move forward with their development. They can't ask for a huge exception for no good reason. They really are supposed to be asking for the smallest thing that will get them to something that's feasible. You'll notice in terms of public notice for the Environmental Planning Commission and for the Zoning Hearing Examiner, all types of notice are required. And in the circumstance for the Planning Commission, both the pre-application and the neighborhood meetings are required for that variance request. So, the Zoning Hearing Examiner, who is that? It's one person who decides whether the conditional use requests are a good idea or not. Is that use compatible? Will it negatively impact the properties that surround it? That's the decision that they're making when they decide on a conditional use approval. The Zoning Hearing Examiner also looks at expansions of non-conforming uses or structures. Non-conforming, meaning when you built it, you met all the rules. But since you built it, we've changed the rules on you. So the city has acted. You have not acted. The city has acted in the interim and has made what you did before perfectly legally non-conforming as to the new standards. So non-conforming from our standpoint is not a bad word. It might be from yours. From our standpoint, non-conforming means you're all good here, keep doing what you're doing, but we're going to limit your ability to expand or renovate without needing to come into compliance with the new standards. So the Zoning Hearing Examiner looks at those requests to expand non-conforming uses or structures to see whether that's a good idea.
So let's say, you know, I don't know if it's a conditional use or whatever, but let's say something is approved that is out of the current zone. And that use is approved and it goes forward and they start to use the building and they use it for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then they decide that they don't want to use that building anymore. Mm-hmm. Then what happens to the zoning?
That's a slide ahead, but they get to keep that use until they've stopped using it for a continuous 24 months. And once they've stopped using it for 2 years, that use goes away,
Okay,
if it's non-conforming.
okay,
Once it's not being used anymore for 24 consecutive months, it goes away.
okay.
Okay?
But if it's a conditional use, you get 1 year to not use it, and then they'd have to ask for another conditional use
Okay,
approval
okay.
again.
So
So it's still an option. but
Exactly.
A process kicks in.
But it's not like, so let's say, I'm trying to think of something that would happen, that a lot was approved for X, and they quit using it for that, then, let's say it's commercial, there was a commercial use and it wasn't commercial before, then is it always commercial? And what you're telling me is no, it won't always be commercial.
won't always be commercial. So just to summarize, it's granted and approved, but they stop using it.
Right,
After 12 continuous months of not using it, that conditional approval goes away. It's 1 year.
they can
For
reapply.
conditional use, you're talking about a non-conforming.
I said 12 continuous months.
Oh, I thought-
That's a year. 12 continuous months or a year.
Yeah.
That conditional use goes away, and if they wanted to start it back up, they'd have to go back to the zoning hearing examiner and get it again,
Okay,
or get a different conditional use.
But you said 24.
So let me step backwards for a second. We're talking about 2 things.
Okay.
One is for things in the use table that are listed as Cs. A C for conditional, meaning there's an extra process in front of the zoning hearing examiner to say that that is a use that will be compatible and not harmful for the surrounding properties. Conditional uses are good for as long as you use them, and they run with the land, not the owner. They run with the land, not the owner. If that use, the conditional use, ceases to be used for 12 continuous months, 1 year, it's gone. That approval goes away. And to start it back up again, you've got to come back to the zoning hearing examiner, do all of these things, and get your conditional use approval back. So that's conditional uses. The other thing that we were talking about were non-conforming uses or structures. That's where today I've got C1, I built a kangaroo hut, and when I built that kangaroo hut, it was allowed by the zoning code, but subsequently the city removed kangaroo hut as a permissive use in C1. Now I've got a kangaroo hut that no longer conforms to the city zoning code because the city changed the code. That kangaroo hut is a non-conforming use. And as long as I keep using that kangaroo hut to keep my kangaroos in, I get to keep that use. If I cease to have kangaroos in that hut for 24 continuous months, I am no longer able to use that as a kangaroo hut. I can use it for other things. I couldn't use it for my
But
kangaroos.
it would revert back to the C1, right?
It would revert to C1, and I can put into that structure anything else that I'm allowed to do in C1.
if you want it.
Okay, so conditional, non-conforming. Clear as mud? Conditional, 12 months. Non-conforming, 24 months. Okay, variances I think we already talked about, so I'm going to move us ahead in the interest of time, but just note that that variance, ZHE, we're talking about that same zoning hearing examiner. Table 611 is really your friend, so please get familiar with the idea that you come here, you look for what the approval is, you look at the notice, you look at what meetings are required, and you look at who's making that decision. The last columns are really going to tell you, how do I do my appeal? If I'm going to appeal that decision, who's going to first review it? That's the R. And who's going to make the decision? That's the D. Okay. If you open the book today, there's a couple edits that you won't see that will be in the final version that's online as of May 17th. These were approved by council as part of the package of amendments that were 6-month amendments to the Integrated Development Ordinance. If you open table 611 today, you will see 2 line items, one for carport in a required setback, and one for a wall or fence approval major. Since we put those in as separate line items, the more we thought about it, the more we thought, those are really types of variances. And it's weird that we're calling them out as their own line items in table 611. So instead, we're going to move all of the content about those 2 decisions into the relevant variance section. So carports is actually in the parking. The standard about carports and where they can be is in the parking section. And so DRB looks at variances to parking. The wall or fence approval major is going back to the zoning hearing examiner. Okay, zone changes, or what the Integrated Development Ordinance calls zone map amendments. There's kind of a size threshold in terms of who's going to make that final decision about zone changes. We also, you'll see references to areas of change and areas of consistency. This is a map out of the comprehensive plan that provides policy guidance about where we want to encourage growth and development and where we want to be very careful that new development reinforces the established character of that area. So areas of change, I hope that's an intuitive thing. Areas of change are where we're encouraging growth and development. Areas of consistency are places where we're saying, if you're going to develop there, you need to reinforce the character that's already there. So you'll see on the map, again, you can go to the interactive map and click on button 2 because it's a map out of the comprehensive plan. You see a lot of yellow. You see a lot of area of consistency. The area of change that you see are mostly the centers and corridors, the places where we're encouraging growth and development by policy. So in terms of zone changes, we've said that the Planning Commission can decide on a zone request that's under 10 acres in areas of consistency and under 20 acres in areas of change. If it's over than that, if the request is over that, the City Council needs to be the ones who decide. Under today's system, there is no size limit. The Planning Commission can decide, except for sector development plan areas, in which case the 10-acre threshold is what rules in today's system. So we've kind of borrowed on that, but expanded it to really be a citywide approach where the Planning Commission has discretion over a certain size, and beyond that, the City Council has to make that final decision. So, for those of you who know our system well today, and you're used to something called R270 1980, that was a resolution passed that provided criteria to judge whether each zone change request was a good, valid, justified, reasonable zone change. The criteria from that R270 have been moved into the Integrated Development Ordinance, so they're now part of the zoning code, which is very helpful as opposed to being a standalone resolution. And you'll see a couple changes in terms of making it a little bit harder, adding one more criterion for areas of consistency to get a zone change. So in addition to today's criteria, you also have to show, if you're in an area of consistency, how that zone change further reinforces the character of that area that surrounds the property in question. The rest of the criteria will be very familiar to those of you who know the R270 1980. So we're still saying we're not encouraging spot zones, strip zones. You still have to look at the comprehensive plan. You can't be harmful to others, all of those kinds of things. All right, let's talk about appeals. And we're getting close to the end, so hang in there. In terms of process, like I said, anything in Table 611 can be appealed. As long as it's a final decision, it can be appealed. And it goes first to the Land Use Hearing Officer, LUHO, Land Use Hearing Officer.
Question.
Yeah.
So before you even get to the appeal, who gets decisions on administrative stuff? Are neighborhood associations automatically, or people who've said to the planning department, I really need to be noticed when there's issues with this particular site? Do you get a final decision? You might get notice of a development, but the question is, do you get the final decision in the end? Like,
so that's actually...
they weren't always issuing administrative amendment decisions. I mean, that's kind of been has generated a problem or two.
Generally, if it's required that you get mailed notice or, I don't know about the electronic mail, but basically if you start the process getting notice Russell, I'm looking at you. Will you still get the notice of decision? The email notice, I think, is a different beast, but if you are on the list for mailed notice, you don't get a notice of decision unless you participate in the process, correct?
That's right. Or if you make a special request, if you get the electronic notice and then you respond saying, let me know what the decision was, we'll send you an electronic notice of decision. But
So-
you need to
Okay.
request it.
So the onus,
Requested. So you want to know about that decision because you think you might have an interest? in
Tell
it?
us.
That might be a problem.
tell us.
You need to know ahead of time.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. La 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 la. I went too far back. Okay. All right. All decisions go to the land use hearing officer who has a hearing, makes a recommendation to council, and council accepts or rejects that recommendation. There are two exceptions. One is impact fees. I already mentioned that the Planning Commission will hear appeals of impact fees before it goes through the LUHO and council. So first stop for impact fee appeals is the Planning Commission. The other exception are decisions that the staff historic preservation planner makes in terms of those historic certificates of appropriateness. That appeal will be first heard by the Landmarks Commission, and then the LUHO, and then council. So two exceptions to the rule, impact fees and those historic preservation certificates of historic appropriateness given by staff. In terms of standing, who has the right to appeal? Who has standing to appeal? For any of the decisions in Table 611 that can be appealed, if you can show that you've been adversely affected, you have standing to appeal. Adversely affected is this language here. You're demonstrating that there's been harm to your legal rights. If you're appealing a declaratory ruling or an amendment to the comprehensive plan, any party has standing to appeal those two things. Next, we give standing based on proximity to that subject property, so to the property where a decision has been made. And we kind of tease out what was a minor decision and what was a major decision. If it was a minor decision, we're going to give automatic standing for a smaller distance surrounding that property. If it was a major decision, we're going to give that automatic standing to a larger radius. And we tease out the neighborhood associations and then property owners. So if you're a neighborhood association who wants to appeal a decision that's minor, your neighborhood association either needs to include that project or be adjacent, unless you can show adverse standing, or adversely affected, in which case you have the right to appeal. These are for automatic standing. If you're within 660 feet of a property that's had a major decision, you're granted automatic standing. In terms of property owners, those distances are 100 feet for minor decisions and 330 feet for major decisions. Nonconformities. We talked a little bit about what nonconforming means. The Integrated Development Ordinance teases out the ways that your site might be nonconforming. So we talked a little bit about use. We talked a little bit about structure. But you can also have a nonconforming lot, meaning it's smaller than the minimum allowed by your zone. You could also have a non-conforming site feature. You could have too few parking spaces, for example, or you might not have enough landscaping. It was legal when you built it, but now we've asked for more landscaping and now you're out of compliance for that. So for each of these kinds of non-conformity, the Integrated Development Ordinance says, here's how much development you do before you trigger compliance with the new standards. In general, you can expand or redevelop up to 25% of your gross floor area before triggering compliance with the new standards. We talked about non-conforming uses or structures. You need to keep them going, and if you cease to keep them going for 24 months, you lose that non-conforming use. There's an exception to that, which is if you're a single-family house and you're in a zone that does not allow single-family, a non-residential zone, you have 5 years where you can have that house be vacant, and still move back into it and continue that single-family use. So we're trying to be generous to single-family homeowners to be able to keep using those houses for single-family. Front yard parking, a big issue in Albuquerque. The Integrated Development Ordinance carries forward the rules that Council adopted in 2007, which say anything that you're going to develop new has to have a parking area that's limited in size, and it has to be improved so that your drippings from your car don't seep into the groundwater. So you've got to either have a paved surface or do enough under the ground stuff that your drippings kind of get caught. The other thing the Integrated Development Ordinance does is kind of clears up what happens if you developed before 2007. So before there were rules in place about where you could park and how much of your front yard you could use as parking, are in the nonconformity section. And basically we say, look, if you built a driveway, even though we didn't tell you you had to, because it was pre-2007, that's the only place you can park. And we're not going to care about how big it is, but you can't park in places other than the driveway that you built because you chose to. If you did not build any parking area because you didn't have to, then we're still going to limit the amount of your front yard that you can use for parking, but we're not going to require that you improve it. So if you're using 100% of your front yard for parking, but none of it's improved, and you built prior to 2007, before we had a rule that said you had to have a parking area, we're at least going to tell you to come move some of your cars because there's a maximum amount of your front yard that you're allowed to park on in the Integrated Development Ordinance. Does that make sense? Kind of. Clicker. So, in terms of implementation, we're still in the 6-month period between when Council acted to adopt the Integrated Development Ordinance and when it goes into effect on May 17th. We've done a package of amendments in that 6-month period that dealt with errors and omissions. And there's going to be one more set of amendments that are going through, and I'll talk about those in a second. After the effective date, the long-range planners here in the Planning Department get to take on a 1-year process. Council has directed us to work with property owners who might have been made non-conforming by the new rules, or who've been non-conforming for a really long time, or who might want to downzone their own properties. We found many folks were surprised to learn, I have a single-family house, I had no idea that I have apartment zoning. I don't want apartment zoning, I want the zoning that matches my single-family house. That would be considered a down zone, and if that property owner wants to opt in to this follow-up zone conversion process, they can, to downzone their property to R1, for example. After that 1-year process is complete, then it'll, believe it or not, be time for an annual update of the Integrated Development Ordinance. And one of the things we've done to make sure that we're keeping this code current is put ourselves on a schedule. So every July from here on out, if you care about the zoning code, pay attention, because that's when we will submit any changes, any text changes to the Integrated Development Ordinance. Those changes still have to go to the Planning Commission. They still go through Council, same process as today, but we're doing it in kind of a proactive and transparent schedule. Question?
Mikaela, what's the difference between annual IDO updating and what's taken care of in amendments?
What we're taking care of in amendments today are little things that we notice are glitches. We're trying not to make huge changes in terms of policy calls. We're really trying to say, let's just tighten the screws and make sure that the table stands for a year. Between now and that first annual update, we're going to notice lots of things. We're going to notice things that we don't like. We're going to notice things that don't work. We're going to notice things that aren't good enough. And we're going to gather all those up and have lots of discussions about them. And then in July, submit a package of changes into the process. So it's really, there might not be much of a difference by the time we get there, because by the time we do annual updates, it's going to be a collection of small things and big things that we're asking to change.
Is this based in an evaluation process?
Mostly it's going to be what we notice throughout the course of that year.
Yeah, like,
So
like,
so I'm going to hold your question because I'm going to get to that a little bit.
Sure, okay.
But it'll be things that staff notices, things that applicants notice, things that neighborhoods notice as we go through the course of that year. The next question is really the answer to what I think you're asking, or the next thing that we do are the community planning area assessments. And I've got a slide on that in a second, but it's the way that we're proactively doing long-range planning with communities to say, what do you need? What changes should we put forward to help? So in terms of those proposed amendments that I mentioned, they were introduced, two pieces of legislation were introduced on April 16th. One is an amendment to residential garage standards in the Integrated Development Ordinance, and it includes a grandfather provision for single-family development. So I encourage you to go onto the project website or onto Legistar to read that. Ordinance 1815 or 1518, I never remember which way it's technically supposed to go, but anyway. And then the second one is a resolution that really provides some clarity about the follow-up zone change process that I mentioned, making sure that it's very clear that that's a legislative action that's going to be taken. Those are expected to be heard on May 7th at City Council. So if you're interested in coming to testify or coming to hear those discussions, I encourage you to go to that hearing on May 7th. In terms of the follow-up Phase 2 voluntary zone conversion process, that resolution, the new one, R1829, replaces the one that we did when we first adopted the Integrated Development Ordinance that sets out these criteria that make a property owner or a property eligible to be part of this follow-up conversion process. If we've made you non-conforming or you were non-conforming before, if you want to voluntarily downzone your property, if you had a special use zone before and you're vacant and you need a slightly different zone, if you've got what we call a floating zone line, meaning you've got one piece of property but there's two different zones on it that don't follow a lot line, we can clear that up through this process. And lastly, if you've got a planned development zone or a non-residential business park zone and you don't match the lot sizes specified in the new Integrated Development Ordinance, then you can come in for a zone change as well. Oh, if you know that you would like to opt into that process, you can go to the zoning conversion map now and put a pin on your property, and then there are boxes below the map where you can put in your request or your concern or your question and your contact information, and we'll get back to you over the course of the next year, but of course we'll get a hold of you before then. In terms of the community planning area assessments, the idea here is instead of waiting for there to be a problem, the planning department's long-range division goes out to each of the community planning areas in turn. We spend 4 months in each area working with neighborhoods and businesses and stakeholders and organizations. We do walking tours, we do work sessions, we do bike rides, asking what's going well, what's not going well, what do you want to see more of, what do you want to see less of, what regulations are working for you, what regulations are not working for you, and generate out of that assessment process recommendations. Those could be recommendations to change the policies that then get put into the city's comprehensive plan. It has a 5-year update cycle. Or it could be recommendations that go into the annual update process for the Integrated Development Ordinance. So it's a way of proactively generating what needs to change and putting it into that system. The long-range staff would be able to do 3 of these community planning areas per year. Over the course of 4 years, we do all 12. So we've managed to cycle through the entire city within that 4-year cycle. And on the 5th year, we gather up everything we've learned. We look across the city. So we take off our little blinders of looking kind of area by area and say, big picture, what's needed here? And do the comprehensive plan update on that 5th year and then start the cycle over again. Question?
When, will the community be notified what areas you're working on? Like, will we be notified what?
Absolutely. And part of the reason why we're not starting the second we're done with the annual update is because there's a process outlined in the comprehensive plan now that says that the planning department needs to do a needs assessment. Who needs our attention first? We recommend an order of each of those 12 community planning areas. That goes to council. Council makes the final decision about what the order is. And thereafter, we work with the community over the course of this 2 years to get ready to say, what should we be doing as we do these assessments? Who needs to be notified? How can we really beef up the notification? How can we beef up the outreach in your area? What are going to be some successful strategies in your area to get people involved so that everybody's got a good idea, even before we start, what we're going to be doing and in what order we'll be doing the assessments in. Question?
I find it very concerning that in the Albuquerque comp plan, the community planning area for the West Mesa is completely blank. There's no guidance for
Right.
the development of that area. And so when you talk about what area needs are, and I'm going, well, we used to have, before the IDO, several other plans that govern development for that area of town. And so I kind of question, why was that not even put into the ABC comp plan in the first place? And secondly, okay, fine, you didn't put in there, but I would think that that would necessitate it being first on the list to be looked at for a needs assessment, because that language does not exist. And this document references you back to that document. And so if that is not in there to help guide the policies that this document references you to, then you've got a problem there in terms of it's just a blank slate for whoever gets creative enough to.
Let me say two things about that. One is the policies from the adopted plans in place today were incorporated into the comprehensive plan in the sections that were relevant. So many of those policies that you're looking for under the community planning areas are actually sprinkled throughout the chapters and still govern and will guide development going forward. The community planning area section right now in the community identity chapter is really about describing what's the character of this area and what are the policies specific to that area that need to be going forward.
But maybe if the policies reference back to that chapter, and if there's nothing written, how does that protect that area?
Sure, I'm just saying that what's adopted now is covered in the document, and over time, those references back to that section get fleshed out through that community planning area assessment process. But I agree with you that some of that needs assessment needs to be how good is the policy coverage, and if there are gaps, that would be one of the factors that we're weighing in terms of order.
Sounds like there's some big gaps.
It sounds like you think there are big gaps. Yeah. With that, I'm actually going to ask my compatriots to come on up, and we'll answer the remaining questions. Oh, Petra, come on up. So we'll do a quick little introduction of who these folks are, and they can help answer questions. So we'll start with Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Parkhurst. I'm a planner, and I've been working on this project for the past 3 years.
Hi, I'm Russell Brito. I'm the manager of the Urban Design and Development Division, where we have the long-range planners and the current planners. So we do both long-range planning and development review, and we coordinate to make sure that everything is up to date and working together going forward.
Hi, my name is Tara Reed, and I'm a planner in the long-range section and a member of the ABC to Z team.
I'm Petra Morris. I'm the council planning manager. I work with all 9 of the city councilors on all their land use and planning decisions.
And she deserves a big round of applause for that.
I'm Carol Toffoletti. I'm also in the long-range planning section and part of the ABC to Z team.
So if we go to the planning department on the website, can we find your names? Not so much.
I don't know that we have an org chart on there.
Like if I wanted to say, I mean, now I know who you are. I mean, I know who you are, but I don't know who you are. Like I didn't know that Russell was Urban Design and Development Division Manager. Is that on the city planning website?
My contact information is on the city website. So if
Okay.
you have specific questions, if I can't answer them, I will distribute them amongst the team.
And we also have an email address, abctoz@cabq.gov, abc to z at cabq.gov, and that email kind of goes to all of us, and we kind of figure out who's best suited to answer it.
I just feel like you're a hidden resource.
We won't be so hidden when we do the community planning area assessments.
It looks like it's here on
Yeah.
one of the handouts.
Yeah.
I have a question about IDO amendments. How are they created? Who's empowered to do them? How do they happen?
Petra will take that one.
Certainly. So the IDO amendment packet that went through council at the beginning of April was generated by issues identified by the planning department, and those were provided to the councilors. We, as council staff, then approached the councilors to say which councilors are interested in sponsoring those amendments, and as these were about the IDO, we were able to get the two councilors that had sponsored the IDO, Councilor Jones and Councilor Benson, to sponsor those amendments. The two amendments that are before us on May 7th, one of those has Councilor Jones as the sponsor. That was addressing some concerns that did not get addressed earlier during the IDO amendment process, that were outstanding concerns from the home builders community. And that was something that Councilor Jones chose to sponsor and address. And the revisions to Resolution 240 was also generated internally when we were looking at the process for the voluntary zone change. We realized we had to make a couple of editorial changes to that, and so again we approached the councilors who are the co-sponsors of the IDO project, Councilor Jones and Councilor Benson, to sponsor that.
And I'll just add that throughout this process, so at EPC, when we were before LUPS and council last year, all of the amendments, all the changes that we've made throughout this process came out of staff reviewing the document and noticing things that maybe didn't work or didn't make sense, through questions that we got from the public at public meetings or at meetings with individuals. If questions came up, what does this word mean? How does this work? Why this and not that? We would note those, and also in official comments that were submitted, we would note those and have a discussion as, do we need to clarify what this word means? Does this rule not make sense? And so a large majority of the changes that have been made throughout the process to amend the IDO up until now have come out of those conversations with the public and questions that we've gotten, confusions that people have had, things like that, and also from staff, because code enforcement has been reading through the document and asking questions. How do we enforce this? This language doesn't seem enforceable, and so we've been responding to those as well. And for future amendments to the IDO, it'll kind of be a similar thing. If there are things that aren't working for planning staff, we'll have discussions about what kind of changes need to be made. If we're hearing a lot from different neighborhood groups or residents that something needs to be looked at, we'll look at that. Same thing from the development community or the council, anyone. As questions and comments come in, those kind of go into the discussion hopper for figuring out what amendments are appropriate to make.
So I did attend that meeting and I tried to do some homework, so I have something meaningful to say. And this has been very tough as an outsider. So I'm always looking for a way in. And my understanding, if I read this right, is that the amendments, that was from material that was like a little over 6 months ago that came out of the community meetings. So and if I looked at the online stuff right, I thought about printing out all the amendments, but it looked like it was gonna be like 53 pages, and I knew my home printer would have a heart attack if I did that. So there's like a volume that's building that I'm having a hard time coming up with. And it seems like there's sort of, and I don't know if 9 months can be considered a delay, or if that's just actually the speed at which things need to move when you have something this large. But if there are comments that are coming in August of 2017 and we're not getting to talk about them until spring of 2018, what are we going to do with this 53 pages of amendments? Like, the horror film I'm getting is amending this in perpetuity so that the content is never getting addressed, and we're sort of losing our time down in these amendments. To an outsider, it looks like this is a document that's not ready. How do we make it work?
That's well stated.
Thank you.
And I can completely understand that. I think we felt very comfortable that the things that were being noticed were glitchy. They weren't rethinking major things. They were, oh, we've said one thing here and one thing there, let's make the language consistent in 2 different places. And yes, there's a lot of that. There were, hundreds, I think, of the technical edits. But in terms of our review, we don't have a backlog. There's no secret pocket that we've got of things that are much, much bigger that didn't get addressed through that amendment process. So we're pretty comfortable that we've got a document that's ready to go live on May 17th, and that we know in a year we're going to find more little glitches. The community planning area assessment process is really the time to look at the bigger picture of how do those regulations work for individual geographies, and then be able to recommend changes, whether they're small geographic maps with different regulations, or whether it's a new overlay, or whether it's a new citywide rule that's going to be better for everybody. And it's that kind of bigger picture thinking in small geographic areas that happens over the course of that 4-year cycle. And then we have the opportunity on that 5th year to really widen even more, look at the county level and say, how is our system working for everybody? And make those policy adjustments that then start driving those annual updates to be slightly different as well. So it's an iterative process, and it's never complete, right? And so you're always doing zooming in, finding things, zooming out, finding things, zooming back in, finding things, and that's the way we need to do. And I think the strength of what we're doing is making sure it's all connected, making sure it's all integrated, and in one place. The policies in the comp plan, regulations in the Integrated Development Ordinance, so we really can keep our eyes on those 2 documents and keeping them up to date.
Can I also add, just to demystify the process a little bit? When the packet of amendments came through, and this will be the same thing as we move forward each year doing amendments, the things that are big policy changes or different directions than the earlier drafts had taken, those are all standalone amendments that get discussed by council individually.
Kind of topic specific.
Yeah,
right?
topic specific. All the things that are kind of editorial, wordsmithing, making consistency, all that is what we call a technical edit. And so if you have limited time, like we all do, focus on the topic-specific amendments. And so what we try to do is a cover sheet that tells you what each amendment is about. And so it's kind of a guide to figure out the things that you're more interested in. And another little bit of recommendation, we know this is all very technical, and not to minimize you trying to understand it, but really, like, if you meet with us and talk to us about your concerns, then we can help explain how the rules address those concerns, or if there's a gap, work with you to find a solution. So we don't expect you to rewrite rules or understand the way everything works. We want to be like navigators to help you understand.
And a resource to you when you want to recommend something.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a criticism.
Okay.
So, those of us who work with, let's say, with the disability population, and we have to use this huge document, which is basically an IDO checklist. And we go down the checklist and we say, oh, I've just done this evaluation, and this person doesn't meet that. This person doesn't meet that. Whoops, this person meets this. Let's go back. And, the failure rate of those kinds of checklists is relatively high. And so when you talk about using a checklist, I'm going, I mean, I'm just wanting to tear my hair out because I know that checklists are so black and white and don't accommodate the gray that is inherent, especially in a city like Albuquerque where we want so badly to protect character. And so I guess I'm asking you, is this all? I mean, when you talk about a checklist, are you talking about or are there, you know, where is the leeway for discussions and consideration and?
Anybody want to tackle that?
You should start.
Okay, I'll just say that when you think back, I'm not going to flip back because we'd all get dizzy if I tried to flip back, but if you think about Table 611 and you think about things that can be decided by staff versus at a public meeting versus a policy decision, that's really where we're trying to tease out what has gray and what doesn't. And remember that half the city today has a straight zone, C1, R1, M1, M2, that are rule-based, and there's no discretion. You meet the rule or you don't meet the rule, you're given the approval or you don't, or you're not. The rest of the city has some discretion built in through the SU1 or SU2 approvals, right? So instead of doing half the city with a special zone, which totals 1,200 individual zones today, we're trying to say, okay, that doesn't work to administer, so what do we do instead? And what the IDO generally says is, let's talk about big decisions and little decisions. Let's talk about big developments where you have some discretion about where you put your site, where you put your landscaping, how much landscaping, and those kinds of things that go to the Planning Commission in terms of plan development, non-residential sensitive uses. The Planning Commission helps with that discretion and that gray and help figure out what's good. But if you're doing a straightforward development that's less than 50,000 square feet on a lot that's pretty much just going to be that, we don't need that discretion. You either meet the standards or you don't meet them. And the standards themselves need to be the quality.
Right.
If the standard itself isn't good enough, then we need to make the standard better. We don't need discretion, right? And so at some point, and of course this is on a spectrum, and we all would have different opinions about where to draw that line.
Right.
Currently, we're drawing that line in terms of size of development, size of non-residential square footage, number of units for residential stuff. If we find after the course of the year that that's not a good line to draw, that line can move. And we need to figure out then for things that do go in front of the public meeting or hearing, does there need to be better quality standards? Do certain things like, it was a big move in this Integrated Development Ordinance to send things next to major public open space to the Planning Commission. That's not a thing today. That was a big move which said there needs to be discretion about what happens on large parcels next to major public open space. Good idea, send those to the Planning Commission. In the future, there may be other similar moves. For now, this is the line that we're drawing in this document.
And then there's further gray to address those special areas with the overlay zones. And the character protection overlay zones, the view protection overlay zones, those carry over those special things from particular neighborhoods or corridors that we couldn't apply citywide. So there's specificity in these mapped areas for special rules, special design standards, use restrictions, etc., that are those gray areas. But it's just not citywide.
They're not gray. I'm sorry, they're not gray. They are rules that you either meet or don't meet, and there is no discretion in terms of staff to add to those rules or subtract from those rules. You meet them or you don't meet them.
Right.
And there's no
But the
special process for
overlays
that.
kind of honor the difference. Is that a good word? I mean, the overlay zones help
I see
identify.
the overlays honor the character that you were talking about.
Correct.
protecting.
Yeah.
And so all three of the overlays, the character protection, the historic protection, and the view protection, which I think is what Russell and Mikaela were getting at,
Yeah.
is that's how we protect those areas that are special and different from just the average area.
Right.
And that's where we're getting at the nuance between areas where just a regular rule applies and it works for the whole city, whereas other areas where you need special rules, and they are special and they are different.
Right, which is great. Other questions?
You guys have done a great job.
Thank
It's
you.
a very complex document.
It is a very
Hard to
complex
tackle.
document. We, throughout the process, have done kind of office hours where we meet with people and just help answer questions. We've also done study halls where you can come and kind of ask your questions as well. So we are a resource to you. And if you still have questions and still want to talk through things, please be in contact.
We're just at the point where we are realizing that we have questions.
Which is great.
It took us this long to get here.
And that's fine. This isn't, there is no end. There is only the next stage and the next time that we open the hood and the next time that we make improvements. So from here on out, we're just part of the community and part of making things better here in Albuquerque. So we've got a good starting point in a new document, 2 new documents, the Comprehensive Plan and the Integrated Development Ordinance, and from here it just gets better. So we'll stick around and help answer any more questions that you're too shy to ask in front of everybody. And I just want to honor that you came and spent an hour and a half with us talking about zoning on a Wednesday night. You had lots of other choices. You chose this, and I salute you. So have a good rest of your evening, and please be in touch.